everybody, we're Queerly Christian from Tumblr.com. I'm Leah, I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Avery, I use they, them pronouns. The conversation we want to have today is a challenging one. And it all started when we were driving to Olive Garden the other day. Because of course you talk about complicated faith stuff on a romantic date. Who doesn't?
I mean, we do. So.
Yeah, and because of the book I'm reading for a class I have this summer, it's a book called Church by Paul Lakeland. Because of that book, we got on the subject of whose faith is true, who gets into heaven, and complicated stuff like that. Okay, so a lot of people call the subject we're talking about today the question of religious pluralism. In this discussion, we can identify three general attitudes, and we're going to talk about those three today. So the first one is the exclusivist view. And this is one I think a lot of people are probably familiar with. This is the idea that only Christians, and to some people, only Christians of certain denominations can be saved, will be in heaven at all. There's no chance for anyone else. You've got to convert or you're not going.
Yeah. According to my grandmother, not even Catholics go to heaven. So there's that.
And for each of these three, we're going to bring up a mountain metaphor just so you have an image in your head. And so for exclusivists, they see one mountain with one path leading up to it. The path is Jesus. All the other paths, other religions, they go nowhere.
I think this view is why evangelism to me is always kind of a strange thing. Yeah. It's a thing that I'm not usually super like, I want to go talk to you about Jesus. Because the way it was always presented to me, usually like in a youth group or whatever, is like befriending a person as a project and not as a person. Like not actually wanting to be that person's friend and getting to know them and like walk through life with them. It's done with the end goal of saving them. Yeah, saving their soul. And I remember as a kid being really terrified for all of my friends who I thought weren't saved. And going to like the fires of hell. You're never in a relationship with those people as an equal. And obviously that precludes any kind of relationship with people who are of a different faith and who, you know, like have no interest in converting.
The relationship isn't mutual. You're there to teach them and convert them, not to learn from them and not to actually relate to them. And so, okay, so we just made the exclusivist model sound completely awful, and that's because, as you can tell, it's not the one that we favor, but this is a nuanced discussion, so in a while we'll talk a little more about the complexity. For now, we'll move on to the next view, the inclusivist attitude in this discussion. So in this one, Christianity is right. It has the most truth, the truest truth, but others can be included in salvation. Yeah, so for the mountain metaphor for this one, there is, again, one mountain, and there are many small paths that represent other religions or viewpoints that lead to the one main path. And so those small paths have things to contribute that guide to the main path, which is salvation in Jesus. So this view does believe that Jesus is the saving force for everyone. Jesus is the way. But you can be of another faith or a non-believer and still be saved by Jesus. Thank you. And so in the 20th century, Karl Rahner is a really famous theologian who popularized this inclusivist standpoint and came up with this term called anonymous Christians to name the people of other beliefs or no belief who are saved through Jesus. It's this way of saying that they're Christian and they just don't know it, which is a problem.
Again, it's like arrogance. It is similar arrogance in the exclusivist. Yeah. Because you're still being like, I know something you don't know.
Yeah. And you know their faith better than they know their own. So that's a fine line to walk. It's because I lean towards the inclusivist standpoint because it's actually, after Vatican II, it's what Catholicism leans towards. But this anonymous Christianity is something we really want to avoid in order to truly be respectful of people of other faiths. We have to respect their faith as valid on its own feet, not as secretly being Christian. That's not okay.
You have to be humble about it.
So we have exclusivists and we have inclusivists, and then we have what's often called pluralists. With exclusivists, the church is over all other religions. It's the only right one. Inclusivists see the church sort of embracing other religions, and the pluralist sees the church standing shoulder to shoulder with other religions. So with this mountain metaphor, you will see many mountains with many paths on them and probably many summits. You know, everyone's kind of headed to a different thing because religions have different goals, you know? So that's that one. With that in mind, maybe our aim in religious pluralism shouldn't be to figure out who is getting saved, who gets to go to heaven, whose God is the real God, but rather just to live with one another, to learn from one another and to support each other, grow together. This idea of mutuality in faith, that we don't need to constantly debate who is right, but rather to share what we have with one another and support one another as we grow.
All right, so now we're going to dive into the biblical support for this stuff. As a Presbyterian, I've been raised a lot of sola scriptura, so I want to see the verses to help me. So for exclusivism, this is kind of these are the verses that I have heard the most often because this is the position I'm most familiar with.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. This verse definitely appears to support this idea that you have to believe in Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Very explicitly, he who believes has everlasting life, and he who doesn't gets the wrath of God.
Yeah. So.
And the next one is John 14:6, excuse me. And it's, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
But yes, inclusivists also have a biblical basis. Yeah. First of all, there's the idea that sort of throughout Scripture that God shows no partiality. And you can find specific verses that say that, Romans 2:11 and Acts 10:34. But you can find it elsewhere too, this idea, even though God picks particular communities, the Israelite people, but in some parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, such as Genesis, early Genesis, and then places like Isaiah, some of the later prophets, we find this hint that even though the Israelites have this particular unique relationship with God, God is still the God of all humankind. And God longs for a relationship with all of us, all of humanity.
And I feel though, for that, I don't think an exclusivist would argue that point.
True.
They would agree that God is the God of everyone, but you have to join our club.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about some of these passages. They can go either way. For instance, with John 3:17, so within that seemingly very explicit exclusivist view that you need to believe in Jesus and call on Jesus' name to be saved, there's that verse, God did not send his Son to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. The world sounds pretty big. It's not just one group of people. It's the whole world. And again, inclusivists and exclusivists can argue what exactly that means, but the verse can support either. It's not a black and white issue.
And this one is also from John 12:32. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And that's Jesus speaking.
Yes, and this is my favorites. So, unfortunately, I was not able to find any Bible passages that seem to support the third attitude, the pluralist one, that Christianity and all other religions are sort of rubbing shoulder to shoulder. There's many mountains. If you know of one, please let us know. Do you want to talk about sort of one issue you have with the idea, like if you decide sort of that all roads can lead to heaven, that you don't have to be a Christian to be saved, what's the point?
Like, why do I have to work so hard at reading the Bible, prayer, which I'm terrible at, guys? Why do I have to work so hard in all of these areas of my faith life, which for me is Christianity, if anybody in the end is like gonna be just fine? And part of that might be my exclusivist upbringing. Like, if you're not right, what's the point? And I remember, so every summer we did Vacation Bible School. At our church, for some reason, we rotated between two things. It was either Jonah and like a nautical theme, or it was the Olympics, and it was running the race marked out for us.
Based on Paul, right?
Yeah. And that kind of thing has always been ingrained in me, that we are to run the race, we are to do the things, we are to follow God and grow in our faith as much as possible to achieve then what is depicted as a prize, heaven. And it kind of reminded me of the parable where there are a bunch of workers out in the field, and they've been working all day, and some guys are standing around in like the market, and the landowner's like, hey, why aren't you guys working? And they're like, nobody will hire us. And he's like, come work for like the last 2 hours of the workday or whatever for me, and I'll pay you. And so when the workday is done, he pays everybody the same thing. The people who worked for like 2 hours and the people who were there since the early morning. And it pisses the early risers off, because
of course it does.
They were there working the whole time, and these other people just showed up and got the same reward that they did. And I have always understood it as people who convert to Christianity later in life. And I was always able to like accept that easily. Like, it's okay if you like didn't get a chance to live like a super holy life
on your deathbed or something.
I don't mind like sharing heaven with you, but then like in this discussion, the idea that there are people of other faiths who will be welcomed into heaven, who are also going to get the same reward as me. And I think the main problem is that the training to think of heaven as a reward. That reminded me, in turn, of a passage from a book I really love, from an author I really love, Nadia Bolz-Weber. Is a pastor in Denver. She's fantastic. And this is from her book, Pastrix. And I'm just going to read some of it. She was given this passage to preach on. And the moral of the story, when she comes down to it, is the landowner, in response to the people who have been working all day and are angry that the later people got the same amount, says, seriously, you're angry because I am generous? And the final line of the parable is, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. This is exactly, when it comes down to it, why most people do not believe in grace. It is fucking offensive. And I love that. Because if we're going back to the run the race metaphor from Bible school, if you've been training as an Olympic athlete for like your whole life, for years and years, and you cross that finish line and you win gold, you're going to be elated because all of your hard work has paid off. But then they also announce over the loudspeakers that the guy in the stands eating nachos gets a gold medal too. You're going to be pretty annoyed because all he did was sit there and eat queso. So that's the offensive part of this metaphor of grace, is that in the end, no matter where we're coming from, God just wants us all, period.
Yeah. And If that metaphor doesn't do much for you, for me, I'm not athletic at all. I don't care about sports. So I came up with another one last night. As a nerd and a student, the idea that you've been studying for weeks for your test, and you know people in your class have not been studying, they've been blowing it off, and you show up to take the test and you are confident you did really well. And it turns out that you did indeed get 100% A+. But because so many people would have failed the test, the teacher curbed the test and everyone gets A's. It's not fair, right? Like, you're the one who worked hard. But Leah actually said, because we that in that metaphor, if it were with her class, that she'd be happy. Like,
because there are only 11 of us in my graduate school class. We've been together since day one, going on 2 years, and we all want each other to succeed. Mm-hmm. So if everyone in the class made A's on something, especially in the classes we're taking this semester, it would be really exciting. We'd probably all go out to dinner.
Yeah. So that's the thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that we all expect to be rewarded when we do good work. But we are also called to love so deeply and radically and illogically that we celebrate when people who didn't work as hard as us get rewarded. I also want to add the disclaimer that these metaphors do fall a little short when we're talking about people of other faiths and this idea that they've been doing nothing on earth, like they've been sitting eating nachos. That's not true, you know. Most faiths center around things like doing good works, like serving others and loving others and worshiping and being reverent. So, you know, they weren't sitting doing nothing. The metaphors aren't perfect, but thinking about it this way, about people we care about and we want to succeed too, we can kind of get over that desire for heaven to be a prize that only we who work really hard win.
And in this discussion, when we got to that part, I realized the littleness of my competitive, kind of petty nature in that, like, in those analogies and in that discussion, that we should just love other people, even total strangers, enough so that it is always going to be a celebration.
Yeah. So we want to bring it specifically to LGBT plus Christians who are listening to this. This topic of who's going to heaven, who gets saved, I know for me as a queer Christian can be scary, because there's a lot of Christians out there who think that because I'm queer, I'm definitely not going to heaven. I definitely won't be saved. And I think so for us LGBT plus Christians, that kind of emphasizes why that exclusivist view, when we focus too much on it, or the question in general of who gets saved, it damages our relationships with others. Because we know what it's like to be excluded. And if you're like me, I know I've been in places in my life where I say, well, those people, those homophobic Christians who are saying this to me, they're the ones who aren't the real Christians. They're the ones who don't deserve to get saved. So then I'm the one doing the excluding. I'm the one drawing the line. Let's close this long thing down. You can look forward in other videos. Hopefully, we want to kind of expand this conversation in more directions, especially that interfaith direction, because we know that there's a lot of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and other issues within Christianity. We want to talk about those.
And we have a responsibility, at least in the Western world, as the culturally dominant religion, to really examine ourselves and to take responsibility for a lot of the ugliness and the damage we cause to other faiths.
Yeah, so give us some feedback on this video. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, what we can do better. And I hope you liked it and hopefully got a little bit out of it. Let us know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we will see you guys later.
Yeah.